years ago, I was an advisor to President Yushchenko about 27 years ago. I know this story from the beginning. This is a story about NATO expansion. And this is a story that you will not read in the mainstream media. This is a story that the US government works overtime to hide and to dissemble. And this is most unfortunate. Most governments don't tell the truth about anything anymore, but I wait for the United States to tell the truth about anything anymore, because I do not believe anything that comes out of Washington these days about this war and much else, unfortunately. Sad to say, this is a war that could readily have been avoided at so many times, because first the Soviet Union and then leaders of Russia said over and over again, do not expand NATO to Ukraine. Is this such a hard concept to grasp? I think we should just contemplate if Mexico and China make a military alliance, the United States is not going to say, and Prime Minister Trudeau is not going to say, well, that's their choice. It's an open door. They can do what they want. That's pretense or arrogance. I don't know which for sure. But the United States has said, we don't care what Russia says about what we do. And it is formal NATO policy, stated repeatedly. Our decisions of where we go cannot be influenced by third countries, period. So NATO assumes that it can move to anybody's border without complaint or response. If you want to know why this war occurred, that's it. That's the one sentence explanation. The rest is details. And of course, people will say, oh, that's so wrong, Professor Sachs. What happened to you? Are you crazy? Because that's what I hear from people who read the New York Times each day, because that's what they're fed. Because we're fed stories. I'm sorry, I was there at these instances. I was actually there. Professor Kachanovsky is the world expert on what happened at the Maidan. I was there the day after because I was asked to be there by the next government, and it was explained to me how the US NGOs, so-called, funded the protests on the Maidan, paid for it. Oh, we'd feel great if the Chinese paid for the January 6th demonstrations in Washington. We'd say, oh, that's just fine. Well, the United States paid for the Maidan, but you won't read about it in the New York Times. So, okay, we live in a world of lies, and the United States is run by confidentiality, except when somebody leaks stuff. But everything is supposed to be secret. So let's just disentangle for a few minutes what actually happened. What actually happened is that starting in 1989 and 1990, the United States and Germany repeatedly, explicitly represented to Gorbachev that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward towards the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union disbands the Warsaw Pact. And you can go on the National Security Archives of George Washington University. The article is called What Gorbachev Heard. And just look at it online. You'll find about 30 archival documents that tell the truth. So the US promised no NATO enlargement. And you know what? I'll tell you a secret among the 427 of us. The United States lied. because already starting in 1992, there were full plans for NATO enlargement, including, by the way, Ukraine as early as 1992. I recently spoke with a leading historian who's working through archival materials. He explained to me Ukraine was on the list already in 1992. Because the U.S. is arrogant. I'm sorry to tell you another secret, if we can just keep it among ourselves. The U.S. believes it runs the world. It's the sole superpower. And it can do what it wants. And because of American values, we can do whatever we want. Whether it's subversive operations, overthrowing governments, launching wars on false pretenses, bombing Belgrade, bombing Libya, doesn't matter. But don't expect to get the straight story, because you won't. Starting in the mid-1990s, there was already a detailed account of what the timeline would be. If I can pull up an article, I'll try while we're talking. I just want to quote to you from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who laid out in a foreign affairs article, which is a kind of way that the insiders explain to the New York elite what's really going on. And he wrote already exactly the game plan. And I think it's just funny to read it. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so here's Brzezinski writing in 1997, September-October issue of Foreign Affairs. He says, quote, "Accordingly, NATO and EU enlargement should move forward in deliberate stages. Assuming a sustained American and Western European commitment, here is a speculative but realistic timetable for these stages. By 1999, the first 3 Central European members will have been admitted into NATO. By that he means Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. Although their inclusion in the EU will probably not take place before 2002 or 2003. It was 2004. By 2003, the EU is likely to have initiated accession talks with all 3 Baltic republics. And NATO will likewise have moved forward on their membership as well as that of Romania and Bulgaria, with their accession likely to be completed before 2005. Check the box. Between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine, provided it has made significant domestic reforms and has become identified as Central European country, should also be ready for initial negotiations with the EU and NATO. It happened in 2008. In other words, Brzezinski's not speculating. Brzezinski's telling you the plan, and he's laying out what is going to happen. Well, this plan did not sit well with the Russians. They said, no, do not move NATO to our nearly 2,000-kilometer border with Ukraine. Do not do it. The United States is deaf. So first came the first 3 expansions, and then, as you heard, there were 7 under George W. Bush, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Then in 2008, okay, drum roll, the U.S. insists that Ukraine and Georgia will be members. And if you look at a map, all they're doing is playing out Brzezinski's plan to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Because with Ukraine and Georgia, you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia completely surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. That's the plan. It's not even subtle. So Putin said in 2007, look, we want to cooperate. We're trying to cooperate, but don't keep expanding NATO, because you said not 1 inch eastward, and now you have, it's 10 countries, and now it's going to be 12, and then it's going to be 14, and you're surrounding us. Okay, again, the United States didn't listen. But there was bad luck for the US, which is the Ukrainian people did not want NATO expansion. If you look at the opinion surveys, and just go on Wikipedia to take a look, because they're all collated in Wikipedia, the surveys at each date, about 10 surveys, large majorities against NATO enlargement. And President Viktor Yanukovych was elected and became president in 2010, and he pushed for Ukraine's neutrality. And he pushed for Russia to have a long-term lease till 2042 in Sevastopol and the Black Sea region, where the Russian fleet has been based since 1783. That's a good reason to overthrow him, which is what the US policy became by the end of 2013. So when protests broke out over Yanukovych's delay in signing an EU accession agreement, and whether those protests were originally provoked or originally spontaneous, I'll leave it to Professor Kachanovsky to help us understand. But soon they were militarized and paramilitarized by really violent groups, especially from Western Ukraine. And we know from a taped intercept on February 6th, 2014, Victoria Nuland discussing who the next government is going to be 2 weeks later. And she describes on the tape her partners back in Washington. Who are they? The Veep, that's Joe Biden, and the Veep's national security advisor, that's Jake Sullivan. So the team is the same team as in power right now that played the overthrow of Yanukovych. Now, when the overthrow occurred, I got a call, come to Kiev and meet the new government. And when a government asks, I went. And when I went, the Maidan was still swirling with people, and a U.S. person explained to me, how the U.S., they were so proud how the U.S. had helped finance these demonstrations. This was an NGO explaining how much money they had put into financing the demonstrations. It made me sick, by the way, to know this, the contrivance and the role of the United States in the overthrow. Okay, we're not allowed to talk about any of that, so please keep this to ourselves. It's just 467 of us. But you will not read about this at all. Then we know the war broke out, not in February 2022. The war broke out in February 2014. And again, Professor Kachanovsky is by far the authority on what happened in Odessa, what happened in Crimea, what happened in the Donbass. But already this was civil war, and already by 2015, NATO was pouring in weapons. And there was a UN-backed attempt at peace, especially the Minsk II agreement, and supposedly co-guaranteed by France and Germany. And the Ukrainians brazenly, this new Ukrainian US NATO-backed government just said, we're not implementing that. So they signed it. They didn't implement it. Angela Merkel said a few months ago in a quite notorious interview, no, it was just to buy time for Ukraine so it could strengthen itself. Well, billions of dollars of weapons went in. Biden came into office, and Putin put forward a draft security agreement in December 2021 that was to be an agreement between NATO and Russia on security arrangements, calling for, at the center, stopping the enlargement. I spoke to White House officials, a senior White House official at the end of 2021. I said, Avoid the war, for heaven's sake. Stop the NATO enlargement. Do you get it? This has been the issue all along. And I was told, never. We will never negotiate over that issue. NATO has a, quote, open door, just like I'm sure we'd say with Mexico if it allies with China. I can't say the real word that applies to this because it's not in polite company. But this is not grown-up behavior. This is provocation of war. So in the middle of January 2022, the U.S. formally rejected any discussion about NATO enlargement. And if you read the minutes of Russia's National Security Council meeting on the eve of the invasion, and the meeting took place, I believe it was the 21st of February, you can see all the statements. They're all about NATO. Putin opens, he says, we tried to stop NATO enlargement, but they weren't serious, and the United States is without any credibility whatsoever. And then Lavrov speaks next, and he describes the negotiating process and how it failed, and that the NATO countries were unwilling to discuss the disposition of NATO. Okay, that's the war. The war broke out. Within a month, Zelensky said, maybe we could be neutral. And negotiations started in Ankara with Turkish mediation. And I spoke to the Turkish mediators. I spoke to people who were deeply involved in this. There was rapid progress made on the basis of Ukrainian neutrality. Then, one day, the Ukrainians showed up and said, no, we're taking a pause from the negotiations. The best estimate given to us by former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett in a very interesting long interview that he gave online a couple of months ago said, yeah, the U.S. stopped it. He said, I didn't agree with them, but they thought that they needed to be tough towards China, that it would be a sign of weakness to go along with this. Honest to God. Honestly, it's worse than 5-year-olds. And so the war continued, the negotiations ended, we've had another year. They don't care about the lives lost in Washington. They don't care. Even Romney wrote an article saying this war is great. Russia is losing, Russia's being bled, and not one American life is being lost. He actually had the stupidity to write that, or the evil to write that. Okay, that's the story. If we want this war to end, we got to negotiate, and it's got to be based on no NATO enlargement. There is no other way this war will end. Why? Because if Ukraine is victorious on the battlefield, Russia will use nuclear weapons. And if Ukraine fails on the battlefield, well, the whole thing's moot. And the third option is the war goes on forever, which is American-style wars. Yeah, sure, we can just fight forever. If we want peace, we actually have to tell the truth, which is that there are limits to NATO enlargement. And I'm sorry to say, Canada is absolutely an accomplice to this. And what's a shame for me is I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. Canada was due south for me, so you were my southern neighbor in Windsor. I always regarded Canada as the sane part of the continent because I knew that the United States was the crazy part of the continent. But I'm not seeing in Canadian leadership now any honesty about this at all. I'm sorry to tell you. And I've had some interactions that I don't like because this is all gung-ho militarism And as Bianca said at the opening, the foreign minister, it was the foreign minister, right, Bianca, who said, this is not the time to talk about peace. This is the time for war. We don't have diplomats anymore, ladies and gentlemen. We just have diplomats trying to prove that they're warmongers. We don't have any diplomats because life doesn't matter. It's Ukrainians there. And the Ukrainians, well, they are suffering beyond belief. Their government has gambled everything of their country on the U.S. backing. It's a terrible gamble. I tried to tell them, ask the Vietnamese, ask the Nicaraguans, ask Afghanistan, ask Libya, ask the Syrians. Is it great to gamble with the U.S. as your backer? Not so good. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks for that totally brilliant and incredibly clear presentation, and just for helping us cut through the thin and to understand the historical timeline as well. So important in making sense of all of this, and the call for honesty. Really hearing that loud and clear. Also, thank you for going against the grain so bravely and telling it like it is. I think the message is very clear. Like you said, we got to negotiate. I found your messaging a very sober reminder of the stakes and the need for peace. So I do look very, very forward to hearing more from you during the discussion period, Q&A. Thank you, Jeffrey. We're now going to be hearing from Ivan Kachanovsky. Ivan is a University of Ottawa professor who has published 4 books and numerous articles, including The Far Right, the Euromaidan and the Maidan Massacre in Ukraine, the hidden origin of the escalating Ukraine-Russia conflict. So happy to have you here with us. Welcome, Ivan.
Thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to talk about this issue, this event, but I think this is a very important issue, and this is a very crucial issue, not only to Ukraine, but also to Canada and many other countries, and to many people in other countries. So this is also a huge tragedy for Ukraine and Ukrainians. And as a Ukrainian scholar, an academic scholar who specialized in the conflicts in Ukraine for a very long time, I based my brief talk at this event on my academic research, which I started since I wrote my PhD dissertation in the United States. And I also specialize in the research policy of Western countries towards Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries. So my talk is based on my academic research. And I think this is very important to, emphasize that representation of this conflict in the Western media and by Western politicians, as Professor Jeffrey Sachs already mentioned, is very far from reality. And I think this is, a crucial issue, because I base my research on original data, on original sources, and I publish my research in peer-reviewed articles and books. So this is why I provide my talk based on my research and original data. And I can say that this war in Ukraine, again, which Russia launched in February of 2022, was illegal and based on false claims of a genocide, for instance, of Russians or Russian speakers in Donbass, or that Ukraine has a Nazi regime. So this was false claim and false justification of the war by Russia. Because I study these issues, again, Ukraine is not neo-Nazi country, it has no neo-Nazi government, and there was no genocide of Russians in Donbass, and there was no evidence that there was imminent attack by Ukrainian forces in Donbass, trying to take back this region of Ukraine, which was controlled by separatist forces at the time, which were supported by Russia. But again, as I wrote before this was started, before the Russian invasion, this conflict, which has very devastating consequences to Ukraine, could have been prevented and avoided. And it was possible for Ukraine to, for instance, become a successful country which would avoid devastation from this war by declaring its neutrality, that Ukraine would not join NATO, And chances of Ukraine joining NATO in any case were close to zero in the near future or foreseeable future. And this was acknowledged by Zelensky, this was acknowledged by NATO leadership and by Western countries, but publicly they did not want to talk about this. And I think this was a missed opportunity. And in exchange, Ukraine could have been offered a membership in the European Union, which would promote Ukraine as economic development, but also would help Ukraine to become a democracy and such countries, similar countries, other post-communist countries like Poland or Czech Republic or Slovakia or Slovenia would have been examples of such future development of Ukraine and peaceful resolution of conflicts. But this did not happen, and Russia invaded Ukraine. But after Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was also a possibility of peaceful resolution of this conflict when Zelensky initially accepted negotiations with Russia, and he again agreed to a possibility of such a deal in which Ukraine could have become a neutral country, and Russia again was basically, I think, according to some information published by Fiona Hill and other sources, Western sources and Ukrainian sources, Russia would have been agreed basically to retreat or to withdraw from occupied regions of Ukraine, with the exception of Donbass and Crimea, which were annexed by Russia. So there was such possibility, but after Russian annexation of these regions, it became much more difficult to achieve such a peaceful resolution. But at the time, this peace deal in April of 2022 was basically blocked by Western countries because they decided to use Ukraine basically as a proxy to fight Russia or to weaken Russia. And I think this is, very important development, which was confirmed by a variety of sources, including Israeli Prime Minister, but was first reported by Ukrainska Pravda, citing sources close to Zelensky. And so this is, I think, based on very solid evidence, which is again not reported by the media or omitted by the media. And this was a very crucial issue to understand this conflict and this war. And this war, actually, based on my research, started with without justification. It was legal invasion and war of choice by Russia, by Putin, but it conflict between Russia and Ukraine, violent conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and conflict in Ukraine, which became violent, started with Maidan, with the Maidan massacre in particular. And based on my research and based on overwhelming evidence, which was revealed recently by the Maidan massacre trial and investigation in Ukraine, this evidence shows that this massacre of Maidan protesters and the police was perpetrated and organized not by the Yanukovych government and his forces, but it was organized by elements of the Maidan opposition, in particular far-right opposition and oligarchic parties, which used this false flag massacre to overthrow Yanukovych and to seize power in Ukraine. And this is, I think, was very important development, which is again not reported by major media, mainstream media. Even so, there are now testimonies of absolute majority of wounded Maidan protesters at the Maidan massacre trial. There are over 500 witnesses which report the same, similar evidence. There are forensic examinations. There are videos of such snipers, which I publish as my research. They are publicly available data published in peer-reviewed articles, which is recently my article was accepted. A new peer-reviewed article about Maidan massacre trial and revelations was accepted by academic journal. So all this evidence is available, but this is again not reported by the major media. And I think this is just one example of misrepresentation of this crucial conflict and its origins and how it was possible to avoid this conflict and resolve this conflict peacefully. And also, after the Maidan massacre, which led to overthrow of Yanukovych government, Russia retaliated by annexing Crimea, which was again illegal under international law. And Crimea was most pro-Russian region, which supported separatists and joining Russia even before, again, Russian annexation of this Crimea. In particular, in the 1990s, there was a popular movement in Crimea for joining Russia, and public opinion polls showed such support because Crimea was populated by ethnic Russians, But again, this annexation was illegal under international law. And afterwards, there was also start of a civil war in Donbass, in another region which was Russian region, according to survey data and according to other evidence. And it was also populated by ethnic Russians. Close to half of Donbass population was ethnically Russian. And this region, basically, there was another start of conflict, kind of separatist war in Donbass. And Russia first indirectly supported this war and separatists in Donbass, and later they intervened militarily in August of 2014 and in winter 2015. And finally, this conflict, which also became conflict not only in Ukraine, but also between Western Russia, because Western countries de facto supported violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government in 2014, and basically treated Ukraine as a client state of the United States. This led, again, and escalated with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, again, which was illegal, which led to very terrible consequences to Ukraine. And I think kind of a solution to this conflict, military solution of this conflict, would be very difficult kind of now to achieve, is specifically peaceful resolution of this conflict. But military solution to this conflict would be, I think, kind of would be much more negative in terms of consequences to Ukraine, because Ukraine has still a big disadvantage in terms of weapons and in terms of military manpower compared to Russia, military personnel compared to Russia, and Russia can still use nuclear weapons. So chances of basically of Ukraine defeating Russia militarily and taking back Crimea and Donbass are close to zero. But this means that if Ukraine would rely and continue to rely on military force, possibility of winning this conflict is very minimal. And for this reason, I think this is a policy which would be very negative consequences to Ukraine without any chances of success. And this would mean that I think peaceful resolution is the kind of is the alternative, which would be again real alternative, which can provide much more, would be more beneficial to Ukraine and Ukrainians in the immediate future and in the long-term future. And I think this is again not mentioned by the media and by politicians who just advance military kind of solution or military kind of basically military continuation of the war in Ukraine to advance their own goals. But this is again not a realistic option, and I think this is why it's a very dangerous kind of development, because this conflict can escalate and Russia can still use a variety of military weapons to escalate this conflict. Even so, Russia is not likely to kind of be able to capture entire Ukraine, all territory of Ukraine. But again, in the case of any kind of development in Ukraine, I think Russia would still be able to keep control of a large part of Ukrainian territory, and which again would be for Ukraine would be very difficult to kind of to deal with in the future, because this would mean a loss of territory and a very significant economic loss and a very significant loss of life, because of very large number of military casualties and also civilian casualties and devastation in different regions of Ukraine, and again a very negative economic impact, which has kind of such situation. In addition to this, there is also very large flow of refugees from Ukraine, including to countries like Poland, Germany, and many of them also came to Canada, and Canada offers such program. But in addition to this, there were also a lot of refugees to Russia. And finally, if I can mention in terms of policy of Western countries towards this conflict, I think this policy can be evaluated based on academic research and based on academic sources, which I already mentioned. But also, I think it's very important to apply the same standards to Ukraine, to policy of Ukraine, as if it would be. Policies which will be very difficult to accept in their own countries.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, I thought we lost you, but I think we got it all. I think we're good. Thank you so much. Ivan, thank you for that presentation, and for doing such painstaking academic work, highlighting the critical history and regional dynamics in the lead up to this war that we don't read about in the New York Times or the Globe and Mail. And thanks also for your compassionate suggestions about how to end this conflict, the alternatives that could benefit the people of Ukraine, and warnings against increased military force. Please do consider getting a copy of one of Ivan's books. They're great resources. We put the links in the chat for those. Ivan is a Ukraine expert at the University of Ottawa and is doing very, very important work and research. It's so great to see all of the interest in this discussion. There's over 450 of us here at this live virtual event. I think that's a good sign. Please do consider sharing this event on your Facebook pages. We're also doing this on a Facebook Live. It'd be great to have even more people watch and get educated on these issues. So thanks so much to our panelists, Jeffrey and Ivan. We are now going to head into the Q&A. We have a little bit of time. And we do have a few journalists who have shown up and would like to ask a question. We're going to see if we can figure out how this works. Rachel, if you could help me just promote Michael to a panelist, Michael Klassen from Bridge City News, or unmute him. Rachel, are you able to do that?
Yes, Michael, you should now be unmuted. Please speak.
Hi, thank you very much. It's been delightful to hear this conversation. I have two kind of forward-thinking questions. The first one is, what do you see as the ramifications of the generational loss of life in Ukraine?
Is this question directed towards Ivan or Jeffrey or both?
Professor Sachs. If I got that right.
Yes. Just to briefly, of course, this is devastating for Ukraine because millions of people are refugees. Young people have left. The economy is destroyed. The cities and infrastructure are being destroyed. It's a catastrophe. And when this war started, I said to the U.S. and I wrote in public that NATO, and led by the U.S., will make Ukraine the next Afghanistan. And by that, I meant a country left in ruins by prolonged war. And that's the path that we're on right now. Of course, to save Ukraine, we need to stop the war through negotiations, not by some military victory, this illusory victory over a country with 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. It doesn't even make sense what our governments say. They have no plan. They have no strategy. They're politicians. They're playing until the next news cycle. They have no strategy.
Thank you.
Thank you. And is that it? Did you have a follow-up?
Well, yes, one other one, and I think it's related. Coming from a Christian perspective, the Bible says that every seed produces after its own kind. Do you see this and what's been happening in financial markets as the sun setting on the American empire?
Well, I think if we're just speaking technically about it, we are at the end of the American-led world by fact, not even by these disastrous blunders, but simply by the fact that other countries, and of course most notably China, but not China alone, has very talented, well-educated, skilled people with a strong infrastructure and strong technology. So a country, the US, with 4.1% of the world population, should never presume to run the world or to write the rules. We are intrinsically in a multipolar world. But the whole idea of neoconservatism in the United States, and that's the government we have right now, and it's bipartisan, it's Democrats and Republicans, is that the US is the unique unipolar country, and it must resist any potential competitors, most importantly China, and Russia is viewed as a more minor regional threat. It's mind-boggling, but that is the literal view of Victoria Nuland. It is the view of her husband, Robert Kagan, who writes these books that are shocking in their naivete, like The Jungle Grows Back, the whole theme of which is the world's a jungle, the U.S. is a garden, and it's the job of the United States to stop the jungle. It's gross. That's actually, I'm telling you, that is the guiding principles. And Canada, please think clearly. Come on. You guys are better than that. Really. So please act better than that. Don't just follow the U.S. line into these wars of trying to defend hegemonic power. The next one will be over Taiwan. That could end all of it. Even this one can end all of it. Today we took what seems to be another horrible step of escalation. If it's true, who knows whether it's true or not true, but I was just watching the video that the Russian government has posted of Ukrainian drones intercepted over the Kremlin. If this is right, are we kidding? And I wrote to leading journalists because they said, the Financial Times wrote this afternoon, I can't even make sense of it. It said, hold on, let me see if I can find it, because it's so indicative of the crazy mindset. Oh my God. Yeah, well, they changed it from when I read it this morning. Now it says, if confirmed, the apparent attempt on Putin's life and the acknowledgement from the Kremlin would mark an extraordinary admission of Russian vulnerability. Instead of saying, oh my God, are we really going to have World War III? It was taken all day by the Financial Times all afternoon as, well, look at this. What is, this is Russian vulnerability. There are no grown-ups right now in our governments or in the media that parrot our governments. Honestly, I'm 68. I've been through the Vietnam War, through the Gulf Wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Serbia, Syria, countless CIA overthrows of governments. I've never seen anything like we're seeing right now. And it may be because of this desperation of the US of somehow seeing its hegemonic rule questioned, or it may be that they've lost their minds out of decades of arrogance. I don't know what it is.
Thank you. Thank you for that commentary. We're going to move on to the next journalist, Alex Koch from the Maple. Alex, are you there?
Hello?
Hello? Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. This is a question for Professor Sachs. To your point, or to your plea for Canada to see reason and to push for negotiations and diplomacy, my question is, do you think that even if Canada wanted to do that, that it would make an impression on the United States and NATO more generally? Does Canada have the clout to actually make a difference on this issue?
Canada, together with other countries, certainly could help the United States to see reality. So if Canada and France, who I know looks askance at this but dares not say so many times, though once in a while Macron lets something out, Germany, India, Brazil, China, everybody knows that this is a disaster, but nobody tells the US. And actually a European prime minister said to me a year ago, I said, why don't you say something? And he said, because they treat us like children. A prime minister of a major European country said that to me. It still makes my skin crawl. I don't know why they allow themselves to be treated like children. The United States is not all powerful. It can't put one foot ahead of the next one these days. So there's actually no reason but to say, you know, this isn't working so well. We actually need to think through this before the world gets blown up. And there is no strategy on this because Ukraine could lose on the battlefield, and if it wins, it gets destroyed. This is, and all we're told, the only thing we're told, Biden had 1 minute of honesty a year ago. He said, we're on a path to Armageddon. All the newspapers immediately rose up in unison and said, don't talk like that. Don't ever say that again. We're not allowed to say that. It's unbelievable. So yes, Canada can make a difference, but not by itself. But the fact of the matter is a lot of leaders know this, but one by one, they're scared.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Alex, did you have a follow-up or?
Yeah, kind of related to that. I mean, obviously this conflict has resulted in new members of NATO being added. So in the short term, it looks like, you know, NATO is stronger in a sense as a result of this war. But in the long term, do you think this war will actually weaken NATO's standing in the international community, or will it continue to grow, in your opinion?
Well, the most important thing is to define the international community. The international community is the US, Canada, Britain, the European Union, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore. Those are the countries that are aligned with the US. The rest of the world is nowhere near this. The attitude of the rest of the world is, holy shit, what are you guys doing? And you're killing us in the interim because we actually have a lot of hungry people. We have a lot of problems. You've disrupted the whole world economy. And so remember that it's 20% of the world is the international community, according to the United States. And then they can't understand, oh, how could Lula say this? How could Lula go to China? How could the Saudis say this? They don't understand anything about the world that I live in, which is the other 80% of the world. Watching this, the other 80% of the world ain't impressed, believe me. And they're not standing up and rooting for the United States. And what we consider the world, or sometimes called the West, which is a term I hate for basically because it's such a bad term to describe this, but it is essentially the North Atlantic countries that have been the dominant countries for the last 2 centuries, plus the honorary members, Japan and Korea, and the Anglo-Saxon offshoots, so-called, of Australia and New Zealand. That's it. And they don't understand that the rest of the world actually has other concerns and doesn't want to back a NATO expansion war and doesn't want to live under the threat of nuclear annihilation because of the unwillingness of Ottawa and Washington to negotiate over NATO enlargement.
Thank you. So we're at the top of the hour now. I'm going to try and squeeze in. We have one last journalist, Aidan from the Canada Files. Are you there? We'll have to be a little bit brief as we've come pretty much to the end of our time. But Aidan, please do ask your question.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Aidan Jonah, Editor-in-Chief of Canada Files. So I have a question for Mr. Sachs. So the Canada Files recently, we interviewed Dimitri Lascaris, who is on a fact-finding trip to Russia, and also Canadian Tamara Lawrence also went on a fact-finding trip to Russia a few months before that. What are your thoughts on the value of fact-finding trips to Russia and understanding their perspective with this conflict?
As a general matter, I'm in favor of all possible discussion and outreach of various kinds, whether it's academics or cultural or sports. I don't want to see Russia boycotted in the Olympics. I find all of this idea of dividing the world to be extraordinarily dangerous, and the idea that we don't talk to our counterparts to be extraordinarily dangerous. For me, fact-finding is fine and good. In fact, not just fine, but Biden picking up the phone and speaking with President Putin wouldn't be bad. Even if they didn't agree, talk. Have a Zoom together. Hear each other's points of view. But that would require the maturity of maybe a 17-year-old. I don't know. But these are kids. These are children, the way they behave. And it's all bullying, shouting, taunting, humiliating, not talking. So this is incredible. When did Prime Minister Trudeau last speak to President Putin? And why not? Canada's got big stakes in this. Is it just we repeat whatever propaganda we want, or do we talk to each other? Hear the ideas. That is my biggest recommendation of all. Talk.
I think that is an excellent note.
Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, September 7th, 2023. We're very fortunate today to have as our guest Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University. He is a world-renowned and much-honored scholar. He is an expert in the field of the movement of geopolitical forces around the world, and historically, he has written extensively on the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and he's kind enough to join us now. I'm envious because when I was an undergraduate at Princeton University, we were not so fortunate as the students at Columbia University are today to have someone like Professor Sachs on the faculty. Professor Sachs, thank you very much for joining us.
It is so good to be with you. I'm absolutely delighted.
Thank you. Can you, I'll let you lecture for a minute or two. Can you give us the basic background starting in 1990? When Germany, the United States, and Russia agreed that NATO would not move 1 inch further east, take us to Minsk I and Minsk II, and take us to the coup in 2014, largely engineered and orchestrated by the American State Department.
Well, you've touched on all the main points that led to this war. I actually go back to the late 80s and early 90s because President Gorbachev asked me to help his economic team, President Yeltsin, asked me to help his economic team. President Kuchma, the first president of independent Ukraine, asked me to help his economic team. So I've watched this close up. Look, it was very straightforward. Gorbachev was a man of peace. He said that the Soviet Union will end the Warsaw Pact military alliance, and the US and Germany were very explicit. This is James Baker, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany. We will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. Of course, it was a lie. It was a lie because as soon as the Soviet Union ended and Russia became the continuation state, or the successor state as it's sometimes called, the United States immediately, within even Bush 1, was calculating, okay, how do we expand NATO? We won, they lost, we expand. Promises, commitments don't mean anything. And already our diplomats, the senior diplomats, Jack Matlock, U.S. ambassador to Russia, of course, George Kennan, perhaps the greatest historian scholar of our time and the original author of Containment in 1947, said this is a terrible idea. Don't break the peace with Russia right away. Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, Bill Perry at the time, said, don't do this. And he thought about resigning. But, you know, Clinton, he didn't think very hard about it. The security state said, just move right on in. NATO expansion started. We know from Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 that the game plan was already clear, the timeline, to go all the way to Ukraine and further to Georgia. And if you look at a map, Georgia ain't a North Atlantic country by any means in the Caucasus.
Let me just stop you right here.
Sure.
You are not saying that Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush changed their minds. You are not saying that events caused them to rethink this. You are saying that they knowingly deceived Mikhail Gorbachev.
No, I'm not sure about that. What was clear in the Bush administration was a division between Baker, who was really a pretty pragmatic guy, I think a very effective guy in a lot of ways, and the hardliners, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, Cheney, who would invent the neocon era, in fact. And so I'm not sure that they knowingly lied in 90. They were giddy, though. Giddy. My God, we are winning. We're going to take all the pieces. But it was really, it was really in 92. After the December end of the Soviet Union in 1991, I happened to be in the room when it happened, as they say. Actually, I was sitting in the room in the Kremlin when President Yeltsin walked across the room, sat down directly in front of me and said, gentlemen, to this assembly of economists, I can announce the end of the Soviet Union. It was a rather astounding moment. But then, as soon as that happened, I think Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld went into overdrive. It was a very strange last year of the Bush 1 administration. Clinton, I don't think ever knew what he was doing in foreign policy, probably until today, in my own opinion. But in any event, we changed immediately.
How does Ukraine enter this sordid history?
I think Ukraine enters from an old proposition going back to the Crimean War of the middle of the 19th century, which is if you can surround Russia in the Black Sea, you've really ended Russian power. And this was very clear to Zbigniew Brzezinski in his global chessboard of 1997. He said that Ukraine was the geographic pivot of Eurasia. And you look at a map. What was the idea? The idea was that U.S. military forces would be in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. And you look at the map, Sevastopol, the Russian base since 1783, is right there, and then it's cornered. And the Russians knew this, and they were saying from the early 90s, don't do this. And then when it started to become apparent that doing this meant not only Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, which they swallowed hard on, but those are Central European states after all. When
Right.
saw that this is NATO coming to their borders. And in 2007, that meant the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. It meant two Black Sea countries, Romania and Bulgaria, and it meant the Balkan states, Slovenia and also Slovakia. They said in 2007, my God, don't do anything more. And that's when President Putin at the Munich Security Conference really laid it out very clearly. He said, look, you guys promised in 1991, not 1 inch eastward. All you're doing is threatening a new conflict. Stop. Well, I think the defining feature of American foreign policy is arrogance, and they can't listen. They cannot hear red lines of any other country. They don't believe they exist. The only red lines are American red lines.
Before we get to the impetus behind this arrogance in American foreign policy, and before you tell us about the harm caused by the neocons, bring us into 2004 and 2014 in Ukraine.
2004 was called the Orange Revolution. It was a contested election. The United States played a strong role in contesting the election, and American-funded Ukrainian so-called civil society institutions played a role, and the election was overturned, and the pro-U.S. candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, won a rerun of the election. And he called for NATO enlargement. But he lasted one term, and in the rerun of the competition between Yushchenko and Yanukovych, excuse me, and President Yanukovych won the next round very handily, by the way. And so Yanukovych came in 2010, 2011, 2012, saying, look, the U.S. in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit said NATO will enlarge to Ukraine. And Yanukovych said, no, please. We are in between. We will be neutral, thank you. It was extremely prudent. This is the key to understand. Prudence, careful. When you're on Russia's border, be careful. When you're in between the Western nuclear superpower, the Russian nuclear superpower, be careful. And Yanukovych tried to be careful. He really did try with skill to be careful. He knew the country was divided ethnically, divided about its beliefs about the future, divided economically. And so he tried to do things to tamp down this U.S. neocon push for NATO enlargement. One of the key things he did was to say to the Russians, look, you can have a long-term lease on your Sevastopol naval base. Yes, it has been your naval base since 1783, and we're not going to tamper with it. Very smart. He said, we will be neutral. This was a big majority backing him at the time.
And what happens to him? What does the U.S. State Department do about this at or about 2014?
Well, at the end of 2013, things got very complicated because the Europeans were pushing hard for a roadmap to Ukrainian membership in the EU, which unfortunately has become completely entwined with membership in NATO.
Right.
And on the other hand, Ukraine was in financial crisis. The IMF was doing its usual twisting the knot as tight as possible. President Putin was saying, you can't make an agreement on free trade with Europe without including us. We are a free trade partner with you. We need to discuss this too. Yanukovych said, okay, we'll delay signing with the EU. Protests broke out, and the U.S. saw its moment. We can stoke these protests. Okay, John McCain will go over there. Lindsey Graham will go over there. Victoria Nuland will nonstop shuttle to Kiev. We can even, overthrow this government that is calling for neutrality. And it's pretty clear in early 2014 that regime change and a typical kind of U.S. covert regime change operation was underway. And I say typical because scholarly studies have shown that just during the Cold War period alone, there were 64 U.S. covert regime change operations. This is it's astounding. Serious scholarship has devoted its time to tracing all the times the U.S. overthrows or tries to overthrow other governments. Well, there's no doubt.
The U.S. overthrows Yanukovych. He's replaced by somebody sympathetic to the West.
Let me tell you, just to say, in this overthrow, and Victoria Nuland, who was then the Assistant Secretary of State for Obama, now is our Deputy Secretary of State. She was the point person in the U.S. engagement in the overthrow of Yanukovych. And in an incredible excerpted phone call, Russians probably were able to tap into the call between Nuland and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat. She described forming the new government, and she also described something absolutely remarkable, which is, okay, we're going to get the Veep, the big guy, Biden, to come in and do his attaboys and make everything work out well. And who was engaged with her on that? Jake Sullivan, who at the time was the vice president's national security advisor. So we've seen this team continuously operating since 2014. Biden's been absolutely part of this since then and before, because he always was pushing NATO enlargement. So what we had was a Russophobic government come in, a lot of right-wing elements, extreme nationalist elements come in. Immediately, Putin said, "You're not taking Crimea for a NATO naval base," and Putin organized that referendum in a completely Russian ethnic part of the region in Crimea, and said, now Crimea is part of Russia. And we know that two breakaway regions in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine were basically military parts of the Ukrainian army that did not want to succumb to a Russophobic regime now installed in Kiev.
Are those the parts of Ukraine, Professor Sachs, that the current regime in Kiev has been shelling and shooting at its own people?
Well, as soon as these breakaway republics broke away and taking some of the armaments with them to defend these new breakaway regions, which were demanding autonomy, by the way, that's what they were demanding. They were demanding the use of the Russian language, the Russian Orthodox Church, the relations with Russia, the family relations, the travel, the open borders, and so forth. The war began with essentially right-wing militaries like the Azov Battalion and so forth, the Banderistas, pretty fascistic ideologies in some cases, attacking in the East. And a lot of people died. Thousands and thousands of people were being killed, civilians, ethnic Russian civilians
What
in
era
the Donbass.
is this? This is before February of 2022, is it not?
This already goes back to 2014 and 2015.
Well, you never saw this on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post.
You incidentally, in 2017, 2018, you saw a lot of stories that Ukraine has a Nazi problem, a lot of Nazi symbols, a lot of fascism. Those stories completely disappeared. But those stories are actually even searchable online, what they were saying back then. But the key point is the following. Russia said, stop killing ethnic Russian civilians. We need peace. And two agreements were negotiated. And the most important was the Minsk II agreement. And what the Minsk II agreement called for was autonomy for Donetsk and Lugansk, for these two breakaway regions, not to become part of Russia. not
No,
to become
who-
an independent state.
Who
But-
agreed? Who agreed? What parties, what countries agreed to the Minsk II agreement, Professor Sachs?
The government of Ukraine, these two breakaway parts of Ukraine, which signed, and then guarantors of this agreement. And this is fascinating because in Europe, the two guarantors were Germany under then Chancellor Angela Merkel and France under President Hollande originally. And the whole agreement remarkably went to the UN Security Council, where it was also backed 15-0 in the UN Security Council. This was a serious agreement. It was never enforced by the Ukrainians. And I can tell you my own experience, knowing many senior Ukrainian officials. I said, look, you've got to honor the Minsk agreement. They said, no, we're never going to do that. That was done at gunpoint. I said, come on, you signed the agreement. The UN Security Council has endorsed the agreement. This is diplomacy. It's to keep the peace. We're never going to do it. And now we know that no Ukrainian leader had any intention of doing it. And then Angela Merkel, just a few months ago, gave a remarkable, very disappointing interview where she said, yes, we knew it wasn't really going to be agreed or followed, but it gave some time for the Ukrainians to build up their strength. We also can surmise, and again, since our government operates in as much secrecy as they can possibly get away with without whistleblowers and leaks, they absolutely told the Ukrainians, don't worry about a thing. We've got your back. You're going to join NATO. And then to bring it up to the present, when Biden came in, of course, no one knew exactly what this meant, but we could have known because Biden's been part of this story since the overthrow of Yanukovych, and he's been part of the NATO enlargement story for even longer than that, so we should have known. But some of us had some hope that there would be some rationality in this process, and Biden instead absolutely doubled down. Ukraine will be part of NATO. We will increase the armaments. The 2021 NATO summit enforced this again. The United States, in the first year of the Biden administration, signed two high-level agreements with the Ukrainian government, underscoring Ukraine's membership in NATO, one with the State Department, one with the Defense Department. Now, at the end of 2021, on December 17th, President Putin put forward a draft security agreement between Russia and the United States. I read it. I thought, you know what? Absolutely negotiable. Not everything is going to be accepted, but the core of this is NATO should stop the enlargement so we don't have a war. And I called the White House at the end of 2021 when somebody was still talking to me, and I had a long talk, and I said, avoid this war. This war is avoidable. You don't want a war on your watch. Oh, no. NATO doesn't mean anything. Blah, blah. I said, if NATO doesn't mean anything, announce it's not going to happen. No, we have an open door policy. I said, that's no policy. That's a path to war. And you know it. You've got to negotiate. Click. So that phone call, as so many in my career, didn't do anything except to tell me, my God, these people do not understand anything about diplomacy, anything about reality. Their own diplomats have been telling them for 30 years, this is a path to war. Our current CIA director, William Burns, very bright chap, sent a famous message to Condoleezza Rice in 2008. Of course, we know about it only because of WikiLeaks. Everything is secret in our society. Everything is lies, by the way, in our society, except when things are leaked. But the memo was famously entitled, Niet means Niet. Don't do this NATO thing with Ukraine of all the neuralgic points you could possibly do in your diplomacy. Well, the Biden people couldn't listen because Newland and Blinken and Sullivan and Biden have been in it up to their necks since 2014, completely irresponsibly, in my view. And on February 21st, 2022, there's an extraordinary Russian Security Council meeting. It's extraordinary because we can read online the minutes of the meeting. And President Putin calls on the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Minister Lavrov, please report on your negotiations over our proposed security arrangements. And Lavrov says, Mr. President, we have failed entirely because the United States has declared unequivocally that NATO enlargement is not our business and that there is nothing to discuss about it. And of course, Putin gave his address to the nation and explained that Russian national security was at deep risk, and the special military operation started February 24. Now, what's absolutely interesting in all of this is that within a few days, Zelensky starts saying publicly, you know, we could be neutral. You know, we don't really have to be part of NATO. This starts within a few days. This was the essence of what Russia was trying to do, not to conquer Kiev. It was trying to push a settlement of this security issue. And Zelensky said
was there a reduced to writing but never ratified settlement in March of 2022?
There indeed was. And I have had the chance to speak with several very, very senior people that were involved in this. And one thing that's extremely interesting, when Zelensky made his statements, President Putin said to his top aides, well, okay, see what this is about. And Ukraine actually put something on paper as a first draft, and the Russian leadership looked at it, sent it on to Putin, and President Putin said, okay, draft an agreement, draft a draft agreement. They were actually negotiating, and they were negotiating in Ankara under a very skilled diplomatic corps of Turkey.
Is this the negotiation with the then Prime Minister of Israel as well as diplomats from Turkey?
Yes.
Let me guess who disrupted this agreement. The U.S. State Department.
Naftali Bennett is hilarious, by the way, because you don't see prime ministers talking this way. He gave a 5-hour interview where he explained his life. He told us lots of fascinating things. And one of the things he explained to us was how interesting it was. He suddenly found himself as intermediary of Putin and Zelensky and Biden and Schultz. And yeah, it was very exciting. And they were working on the 7th draft, and they were making progress. They were coming close to signing. And then Naftali Bennett explains in this wonderful interview, quite remarkable, he says, then they stopped it. They stopped it. He says the Americans stopped it. And he actually explains, by the way, they stopped it because they wanted to look tough to China. They were worried that this could look weak to China. So it's not even a proxy war with Russia. It's all about China in this crazy, crazy, topsy-turvy, weird failure of diplomacy. And then, of course, after Bennett says this and everyone's shocked, he walks it back. No, I didn't say that. I didn't mean it. Because that's the other way that our world works, is when a little bit of truth leaks out, you deny it, even though it's in front of your eyes, even though you could play the tapes again and again. So the United States stopped the diplomacy, and Ukraine has been the victim. And I would say, of course, its leadership doesn't represent the interests of the Ukrainian people, in my view, at all, because this has been a bloodbath since then, a tragic, predictable bloodbath. And all of the shows you've had, Judge, with Scott Ritter and with Douglas McGregor have explained all along why this is going to be a bloodbath. I know the economic side, that the sanctions weren't going to work. I understood the diplomatic side. I didn't know the military side. But this has been a predictable bloodbath, and the Americans have known it. And even this vaunted counteroffensive of the last 3 months, they knew this wasn't going to work. But, you know, Biden, he's running for re-election. Zelensky, he's dug into this. So we have this terrible, terrible phenomenon of the interests of the world being staked on the interests of a few politicians. This is
Right.
completely upside down.
Wow, what an extraordinary, remarkable, gifted, no notes in your hands lecture on all of this. Where do you see this going? I mean, Victoria Nuland and the neocons who have brought us to this precipice are not going to back down. In my view, they want to use Ukraine as a battering ram for their fanciful view that it can drive President Putin from office.
Everything can still happen except that, I'm pretty sure, in terms of what will happen on the battlefield. It could be that after the exhaustion of this Ukrainian counteroffensive, which is exhausted and which has claimed tens of thousands of deaths and so many wounded and massive destruction of the military equipment, the miracle weapon shipped over, could be that Russia launches a major offensive and changes completely the situation. This is one possibility. Another possibility is that this grinding, continuing, bloody, horrible war continues because a few politicians don't want to admit how wrong-headed, predictably wrong-headed this whole thing is. There's always the chance also that these completely intemperate and irresponsible people in our government aim to escalate. Because maybe the situation turns down and they say, oh, this is bad for Biden's reelection, as if we should care. Our politicians work for us. We don't work for them. I never care about a politician's reelection. I care about what they are doing. But if they decide to escalate, we're talking about the world's two largest nuclear superpowers, and never we should put that out of our minds. We shouldn't. We're told, oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But, you know, I've been studying this issue also for decades. We should always worry about what intemperate, dangerous, intemperate people in dangerous circumstances can do, how accidents can happen, how we can lose control of events. It's all terribly dangerous. We need a completely new approach to all of this. Predictably so, because you could have known back in 1990 or in 1997 or in 2007 or in 2008 or in 2014 or in 2021 or in 2022. This was a huge, huge blunder of Biden. We need a new approach. Frankly, he needs a new he needs a new foreign policy team. This foreign policy team is so dug in. Of course, he's dug into it too, but he's the president, right. So he needs to hire a new team that knows how to get out of this absolutely catastrophic mess.
Professor Sachs, I'm in awe of your knowledge of this. I usually speak a lot more during the show, but far be it from me to interrupt you. We'll call it quits now, but I hope you can come back because I'd like to ask you some more questions. This
anytime.
Professor, this has been a brilliant, gifted analysis, consistent with what this program has stood for, consistent with the military side of this from Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter, consistent with the intelligence side of this from Larry Johnson and Ray McGovern. And all
Judge,
of these people are fans of yours.
You have been saying it straight from the very beginning, and you're the only one in our countries that got it from the start so clearly on all of these dimensions. And I just really praise you, and I'm honored to be on your program.
We'll do it again soon, Professor.